You've heard of heroic labs by now, and we keep talking about them because in today's mature market, you need every edge to be successful. Rather than spending those precious company dollars on building game tech, focus on building your game and shipping it. Get into your players' hands faster and grow your community. Heroic Labs is battle-tested partner and friend of the podcast. Their tech enables you to be flexible, creative, and scale for success. Heroic Labs has your tech stack covered. Whether you're looking for a world-class back-end game server, an amazing game development framework, fantastic live ops tooling, or reliable mass scalability, Heroic Labs has solutions for all of these challenges. And it's not just us at Deconstructor of Fun praising Heroic Labs. The company works with some of the world's biggest publishers on many of the beloved games. Focus on your game, save a big chunk of cheese, and avoid tech risks with Heroic Labs. Archibald Stonehill, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. Finally doing it.
I feel like I have to talk to you in an English accent, which I don't know.
You have this inexplicable American accent for some reason.
I know, it's just so fake. Anyways, Archibald Stonehill, you were formerly a McKinsey consultant, which is, of course, testament of your hard work, determination, ability to learn things super fast, and communicate well, right?
Yeah, and expertise in video game development.
Yeah, and expertise in everything, really, at a fast pace. So now that we got Eric Kress throwing up in his mouth, let's talk about your other experiences. So you're a former partner at Makers Fund.
Principal, then a maybe partner.
You're almost a partner at Makers Fund.
Almost a partner at Makers,
and a principal, where we met because you were a board observer at my startup.
I was, yeah.
At least I'm correct on something. And currently, you're a chief product officer of Stash. So what is Stash? Would you mind telling us?
Yeah, so Stash is a startup in the kind of gaming direct-to-consumer platform space. So we provide kind of a complete set of solutions to help games sell and interact with their players directly outside of intermediated platforms like the app stores. So that includes payments, web shops, launchers, all of that.
All right. And Stash has also been going hard into the podcast scene. So you released a couple of big podcasts. First one was Mitch Lasky, high production values, well made, interesting content.
Yes. We have a podcast called Secret Stash. We've released 2 now. So the first one was with Mitch Lasky, who's like my number one guest when they asked me who we'd want to do it. And he's like a legendary executive and investor in the games industry. The second one is with our founders, who include like Justin Kahn, who founded Twitch, Robin Chan, who sold his company to Zynga, and then Dan Borsman, ex-Google.
Powerful crew. But we're not here to talk about Stash. We're here to talk about DMA. So why are we talking about DMA? Like, Archie, like, what's the point of this?
So I think that this has been like a really exciting thing for the industry over the last year, but you've seen a massive shift in government policy and big tech broadly, and that is manifesting in a bunch of different ways in different countries, and really games are at the heart of it because governments across like the EU, China, South Korea, Japan, etc., and even the US have been looking at like how digital markets operate and assessing that there is like some unfairness there. And I think game developers are not surprised by that because they've experienced a really kind of tightly controlled distribution landscape for our entire industry's lifetime. But governments are kind of for the first time really taking aim at assessing whether or not these are like illegal business practices, for example, like the App Store distribution policies that we have to deal with. And the DMA is like probably the most visible and most like immediate application of that. It's a piece of legislation in Europe called the Digital Markets Act that came into enforcement on March 7th, 2024.
Yeah, and it came with big promises. It promised good times for advertisers, publishers, and web stop vendors. There's like 3 things. It allowed apps to link ads to web stores and offer third-party payments. The second promise was allow sideloading and third-party app stores. And the third promise was to give developer access to more complete data from platforms. Then when it went through, Apple got its greedy hand on it and they proposed the following: reduce fee for alternative app stores to 17% with a 3% processing fee, introduce a runtime fee of 50 cents for yearly downloads exceeding 1 million, and then subject third-party app stores to Apple's rigorous checks scare screen. So the way I'm a dummy. I don't know what happened. It promised everything, and then Apple came in and you're not gonna get anything. Is this the summary of it?
So Apple's fighting it, but I think that this is a nice way to talk about why this is very different from maybe where we were 5 years ago. So then this is true to a lesser extent in America, but equally it's we're seeing a shift. But the way that governments are interacting with the app stores now is completely different from how it's been done for the last 40 years. And so there's definitely resistance to it, but there's the EU has a lot of teeth now. So the kind of conventional way that governments have regulated competition policy, at least since the 70s, has been about consumer interest doctrines. So it's as long as a kind of consolidation of market power benefits consumers, almost always in the form of lower prices because of economies of scale, governments have been okay with that. That was not always the case with how governments thought about competition, and the problem with that model is it's been very hard to police someone like an Apple, which gives, in theory, it gives away distribution services for free, right? It doesn't charge consumers for distributing their apps. Similarly with Google, right? Google can say we give people search for free. How is that not good for consumers? But that's kind of a very superficial way of evaluating whether or not these markets are hindering or promoting innovation. And I think that the DMA's framework is a massive divergence from that way of thinking about competition policy. It looks at competition as an inherent good in and of itself, and does a couple things to address that. So the first is it starts by designating certain core platform services as fundamental infrastructure of the internet type entities. So this would be something like App Store distribution. It says this is a public good utility that needs to be operated in a way to promote competition. And then it designates gatekeepers that operate these core platform services, which are very large companies that have massive influence. And then it places a certain set of obligations on those gatekeepers to demonstrate that they are creating fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory policies that aren't preferencing their own products or blocking competition and stuff like that. And it designated Apple and Google gatekeepers both in their operating systems and in their App Store distribution payments and stuff like that. So the gatekeepers then have the legal obligation to prove they are complying with these obligations, which is very different from how you might think a lot of kind of legal cases work, right? The onus is normally on the prosecution to prove harm. In this case, they kind of need to demonstrate that they're in compliance. And the EU's enforcement mechanism for this is particularly interesting because it's done not at the member state level. So a lot of EU legislation is passed and then you can sue in court in Germany to enforce it. This is actually done at the commission level. And so the only real precedent for that is GDPR. And I think a lot of people will be familiar with how visible GDPR has been as a piece of legislation. This is the kind of level we're talking about. And this means that it will not be held up in courts for years. It can be done with fairly quick executive authority, and the potential punishments if these big tech companies are found to be non-compliant with the DMA are huge. So it's 5 to 10% of global turnover can be fined. So these enforcement began on March 7th. I think it took 3 weeks for Apple and for the EU to announce its first investigations into non-compliance. And the thing that they were looking at most is app stores. So there's been a lot of resistance from Apple, to some extent similar level of resistance from Google, but the EU's also signaled it's not messing around. It's launched these investigations, which they are signaling will be done by the end of the year. And I think it's highly likely that aspects of their new compliant policies are to be found to be non-compliant with their obligations as gatekeepers.
Got it. So when Apple said that it will reduce the fee for alternative app stores to 17% with a 3%, so basically 20%, that is their sort of we're being nice, here's what we're going to do. And then when they said they're going to introduce a runtime fee of 50 cents for yearly downloads exceeding 1 million. So 50 cent for every download that goes over 1 million. That is their like proposal as a good faith actor, right?
Well, so I mean, I don't know about that. I can't comment on their faith as actors, but Apple's response was so this is all about giving developers choice. So the EU said you need to give developers choice. The thing that the regulators are uncomfortable with is like deciding a price. So the EU, the regulators don't want to like look at the App Store and be like, all right, they do provide services, they provide discoverability, they provide distribution, they provide and that has value. Is 30% a fair fee for that? Like, who knows? The governments aren't really comfortable being like, 30% seems high. What they say, though, is, all right, well, if you're going to offer your services in App Store distribution for a certain price, you need to have a competitive market to set that price. So they're much more comfortable saying, all right, if you're not willing to kind of negotiate on price, or we don't want to be price setting, you then need to be allowing competitive app stores a chance to price compete with you. And so you need to give developers a choice, is basically what the EU's position was. The way that Apple responded to that is said, like, all right, we'll give them a choice. So they gave them, so in the EU now, you can elect into these alternative terms. So you have two terms you can choose. One is stay as things are, distribute through the App Store alone, use our payment system, 30% fee. Second is the alternative terms, which is what you were describing. And that immediately switches you into a different economic model. So the first aspect of that is a reduced commission on the App Store, as you said, and no commission for downloads outside of the App Store. So 20% versus 30% on the App Store, and nothing if you download the app outside of it. Plus, as you said, 50 cents per install. Now that begins on the 1,000,000th install via the App Store, but begins on the first install outside of the App Store. So that's your new model, which actually is not that bad for a lot of games. And games are maybe the one kind of app category where these economic terms kind of make sense. Think about it like this. If your game makes more than $5 per user per year, right, you actually start saving money by switching into alternative terms, even if you only distribute to the App Store, right?
But you don't know if your game is going to make that, because isn't this applied only to new products? Like, you can't switch to this model, right?
You can switch to it today.
Oh, you can switch your existing game. So if I'm like, I have Raid Shadow Legends and it has like
I'm surprised they haven't already.
Yeah, got it. Okay.
Yeah.
This podcast is brought to you by AppsFlyer. In today's digital world, understanding your app's journey from discovery to download is more than just insightful. It's essential. Enter AppsFlyer, the leader in mobile attribution and marketing analytics that allows you to measure the full potential of your marketing efforts, making every ad dollar work smarter. With AppsFlyer, that's your new reality. Dive deep into data-driven insights that reveal exactly where your users come from and how they interact with your app. AppsFlyer, where your app's potential meets performance.
I mean, you have to apply, but 100%, I think you'll see a lot of the core games and a lot of the strategy, casino, etc. switch to it. The weird thing is it really then changes how you have to think about your operating model, because now you have a disincentive to get like large top of funnel installs, which is kind of the opposite from how everyone's been responding to IDFA, right? IDFA made everyone be like, all right, you just got to bring everyone in and then find your users then. Now you really have to try and figure out who to bring in, right? Because you're going to pay 50 cents per install. So it's probably going to require some adjustments in terms of how mobile studios operate.
Who do you pay that 50 cent per install?
What do you think? Apple, obviously.
Why? Why?
It's for their core technology fee, right? It's their core technology services that they're getting.
God damn it. These guys are capitalists through and through.
I've been quite surprised by how, I would say, hostile that tone of their response has been to this stuff. Like, but we're seeing this is a similar case in America. Well, somewhat similar. Like, I don't know if you want to stick with the DMA, but I think it's helpful to look at the American case where you have a bunch of stuff going on in America. But America, I think, is far less like the LCPS legislation, like the DMA. There is an app called the Open Apps Market, but no one's hopeful.
So let's talk about the acronyms a little bit, because there's DMA,
right, cool. Yeah,
MDMA, DMCC, DOJ, DSA. What doesn't fit in?
Yeah. So DM almost always refers to digital markets, and that's kind of the thing that we're talking about here. So what you just described is like the alphabet soup of competition policy and government regulators, and there's many more. DSA, yeah. And so digital is a really key one, because what's being recognized here is that like regulating digital markets needs to be done in a way that is different from how governments have been doing it. The last big antitrust case of of technology was Microsoft in the browser wars in 1990s, and that's really the only one in the last 40 years. So digital is key. Markets is also key. So DM, like this is about how services are distributed through the internet. And like unlike in the, physical IRL realm where like, governments have a strong say in how prices are charged on roads that you ship goods in and stuff like that. Like these digital markets are like privately owned by Apple or Google or Microsoft or whoever the case may be. And so, but what they're really trying to do is like enhance competition and innovation in digital markets. And then the A, the C's. C is often consumers or competition. And so the big pieces of legislation to be aware of, like in Europe, DMA is the like leader in this in terms of timeline. It's the test case. If it goes well, I think you could see a lot more copycats around the world. And then in the UK, you have the DMCC, the Digital Markets, Consumers and Competition Bill, I think. That is going to pass, I think, in Parliament. Like, there's a lot of confidence in it. It's been through a bunch of the rounds of amendments, stuff like that. That's very interesting one to watch because that one has serious teeth and has an interesting intersection with the EU's, like, with the UK's oversight of mergers. And then in America, you also have similar legislation to those two acts in South Korea and Japan and Australia now. India is also passing one, Brazil. So really, I think that if you leave America, right, all of these are American companies. So if you're the EU, you look at like Google and Apple, and you're like, all right, these guys don't pay any tax, right? They don't work here. There's some people in Ireland, but like they don't really do that much for us. So that's why you've seen a bit of like aggressiveness on behalf of global actors. These are American companies. So America, there's political reasons it's tougher to pass legislation on this stuff there. That said, American antitrust policy has transformed over the last 4 years, and there's been like a collection of new kind of crusading antitrust thinkers that have taken office there, and they're trying to use the courts in America to make changes. So that's the DOJ, the Department of Justice.
Got it. And yes, there has been a change in the antitrust. I don't know these terms, but I remember that there was this lady that was really fighting back. Lena Khan, yes, correct. I remember from Twig that this lady was fighting hard against the acquisition of Activision by Microsoft, and she's part of the of that
the new Brandeis movement.
The new Brandeis movement.
They're also called the hipster antitrust activists.
Got it. The hipster antitrust. So there's nothing wrong with antitrust. It's actually very good law.
A lot of good
to have antitrust. Yeah, it's like it really is against these monopolies that we have become so used to and are in full mercy of them. And the whole IDFA thing just proved how tough they are on the industry and how much randomization they can have. So, thumbs up for antitrust. But what does it mean? Like, what is the sort of a context, the history? Like, how do we get here? Is Lena Khan the start of the antitrust crusade against the big corp, or like, what is it? This podcast is brought to you by Data AI. Now, you're asking, didn't they get acquired by Sensor Tower? They did, and that's awesome. Here's why. Whether you loved using Data.ai or Sensor Tower, the combined company will offer customers even stronger and more detailed insights on the full digital customer journey. Exciting times lie ahead as Sensor Tower and Data AI join forces. Go to Data.ai or SensorTower.com and get on board with undeniably the best data partner in the business. Now, back to the episode.
Yeah, I think it is a really interesting story because a century ago there was very similar parallels to where we are now. So like the modern antitrust movement comes from the regulation of the oil market and
oil barons. I remember reading about that.
Standard Oil was the big one, right? So what happened was like the oil, like there was so much consolidation in the oil market that they passed something called the Sherman Antitrust Act. This is Rockefeller's company, so if everyone knows J.D. Rockefeller. And this act basically, is set the precedent for like how antitrust is thought about today, which is like it's in the people's interest and government's interest to maintain competition because monopolistic pricing power is kind of detrimental to consumer interests. So I was passed in 1890 and then really came into force in 1911 when Standard Oil was broken up. by the Supreme Court. I think it broke up into like 11 or 13 companies. This is a huge moment. I'm actually writing an article about like why it's an interesting parallel now. One of my favorite anecdotes for this is that when Rockefeller himself was told that the Supreme Court had broken up Standard Oil in their ruling, first thing he said was buy Standard Oil, like the share price. Because he knew, and he was quite right, that the broken up entities were collectively worth a lot more as companies than the single entity was. So he became far wealthier when they broke up Standard Oil. And I actually think you would see a similar thing happen today. I don't think you'll see breakups. But this was kind of like the Sherman kind of policy of, being wary of monopolistic kind of market concentration for monopoly's sake was enforced until like the 1980s, where you had a new doctrine which basically recognized that like sometimes monopolies can be beneficial to consumers because bigger companies can lower prices, etc. And that's really where we've been living for the last 40 years. Is that there's the kind of thinking is so long as kind of consolidation benefits consumers, almost always in the form of price, it's a good thing. And that has basically gutted any government regulation of antitrust, because almost every merger, for example, can be argued to have pricing benefits for consumers, at least in the short term. And
in the short term is the important point.
Exactly. Like economies of scale are great, but then when you have monopolistic market power, you can block any competition, right?
Yeah, and then you start skimming.
And I think this is where we are a little bit, right? Which is like, there's many benefits to the way the App Store ecosystem works. At the same time, it's also led to like really, really aggressive. And I actually think aggressive pricing and a lack of innovation. Like I think a good parallel here is Steam versus the App Stores. Like Steam has its problems for sure, but it's more competitive than the App Store on iOS is. And if you look at something like Baldur's Gate 3, like Baldur's Gate 3 was a hugely ambitious game, which was financed largely on early access revenues. And Steam was very reluctant to adopt early access. They had a much more curated approach to the content they allowed on the platform until Itch popped up like in the early 2010s and was kind of a competitive threat to Steam because it was this indie distribution, work in progress thing. So Steam kind of reluctantly launches their early access program as a way to compete with Itch. And then because of that, you get all of these indie game developers making amazing games because they can finance them through early access. And I think it's an example, and you know who benefits most from that? Steam, right? So Steam ends up benefiting massively from a game like Baldur's Gate 3. I think it's like a nice illustration of the kinds of benefits you get when there's a competitive market, because you arguably wouldn't have had Baldur's Gate 3 without Itch competing with Steam. We don't know what we would have had on Apple. I think we can actually see some things we didn't get, right? Super apps being a big example, and so the new doctrine that is like. Lena Khan is a big proponent of it. The other two that are in the government in America that are part of this are Thomas Wu, who's on Biden's Economic Council, and Jonathan Cantor, who's head of antitrust at the Department of Justice, so who's leading the case against Apple. Like these are three people associated with this kind of not new way, it's the old way of thinking about antitrust, but like reviving that. I think the Activision case was like an unfortunate introduction for Lena Khan to the games industry because it was not the one. Like it was, the Activision case. It was just like, love the thinking, but like this isn't the merger to block. I think that the games industry will probably have a much better reception to some of the cases being pursued by the DOJ now, like Apple's.
Interesting. And how come we're hearing so much about App Store changes?
Yeah, so this is because like, so in the EU, you've had the DMA. In America, you have. Well, in America, you also have the civil cases against Epic, which are really important. So, like, everyone pretty knows Epic sued Apple and Google. It lost most of the Apple case, but it didn't lose one count, which was out of app payments. And it won in a really unprecedented ruling against Google. So, it run all the counts. And we can talk about why, if that's interesting. But, like, even from the Apple case, they had to now allow for link outs. So, the thing you've seen the most kind of progress on so far is web shops. Like there's a couple different ways to monetize your app without charging consumers using Apple's like payment services. Web shops have been the like most ascendant, and like link out policy has been like enabling that. Sorry, dog barking around.
So, and just so that we understand exactly what these mean. So by saying link out, that is allow apps to link ads to WebStar to offer third-party payments, right?
Yeah. So not necessarily ads. So this is kind of something that you see in rise in the last like 3-4 years is like charging for in-app goods outside of the app environment. So like Playtika's built a $660 million revenue stream where it charges for its in-game items via web shops, and Scopely's done it too. And then similarly, you have like Spotify and Netflix are like parallels here, where they are a lot of the engagement happens in the app. So in some way, you've got to get consumers to buy something they used in the app, but outside of the app. Web stores, yeah.
All of us use many apps, and most of these apps monetize outside the app store. Like you make your subscription to your mental health, your recovery, your gym app outside the app store. And it was absolutely normal for as long as I remember. And now this is like a big thing. Like, I don't get it.
So it's about friction, right? And so the apps you're describing, like, yes, a lot of them you subscribe to outside of the App Store. And the reason for that is because they don't want to pay 15%. A lot of them have cut sweetheart deals. So I think Netflix was being charged 0% maybe for its...
Wow.
Yeah, it was either Netflix or it was really bad. It came out during the Epic trial. So they've had preferential deals, a lot of them.
Wow.
But the thing about those apps is the engagement happens outside of the App Store too. So you also watch Netflix in your Chrome browser on your PC. So it's it's more integrated into the engagement flow, that monetization channel. Think about like a slot game from Playtika or like Scope games, unless you're cross-platform, and that's a big part of this too, you have to get consumers to visit a totally new environment to make these purchases. And unlike subscriptions, where the purchase event happens hopefully just once, you have to get them to do it again and again and again. So it's because of microtransactions. So it's a lot harder for games to do this than it is for subscription services. Cool. But that's why 70+% of revenue that Apple and Google generate from the app stores is generated from games. So that's the thing that everyone cares about here is games.
And when we're talking about link outs, does that also mean sideloading and third-party app stores? So can you just talk about what is sideloading and what is third-party app store, like for those who don't have an Android device, never held one in their hands?
So they're different, right? So one is about where you're buying things. The other is how you're distributing and getting your apps. I like to think about this in like 3 parts, right? So there's like, how are you paying for things in the app? How are you paying for things that you use in the app but outside of the app? And then how are you accessing the app? Or how are you downloading the app? So on Google, you've been, in theory, able to download things from non-Play Store stores forever. On Apple, you've never been allowed to officially download apps except through the App Store. So sideloading is the downloading of applications outside of an app store, either direct from a developer's website, like you do on a PC or a Mac, or through an alternative app store that you sideload, which, there's a couple of those coming. And if you distribute outside of the App Store, you don't have to pay App Store commissions. Like the commissions are all linked to the App Store distribution services. Sideloading will be one to watch. Like it's one to watch really very closely. There's a lot of like user experience, like blockers that Apple and Google erect to make it a harder experience to sideload an application. But it would be a huge unlock if it took off. So
basically, the thing that Apple did is the subject third-party app stores to Apple's rigorous checks screen would mean that if I'm browsing through Instagram, I see an ad for a game. I'm like, oh, great, I'm going to download the game, but it's taking me to a website where I can download that game.
Actually, this is a really interesting question. So, and this ties back to link out. So, as well as all of these policies, there's another very important set of policies called anti-steering policies. And these policies block you from steering users to alternative payment methods or alternative install methods from within an app that Apple has distributed. So if I have an app that I've distributed to players through the App Store, I have real limits on what I can do within that app to inform users about or link them to anything that is competitive with that App Store or the in-house payments. This is why you are not allowed without, and this is one of the things that has already changed and is really being figured out now, is you are not allowed to direct users from within an app that Apple has distributed to a web shop or an alternative downloads channel. So I do not believe, I could be wrong about this, and I'm interested to look it up, because if Instagram was directing users to download Instagram from Instagram's website, that would be a clear violation of store policy. If I am doing an advertisement on Instagram for my app that is not Instagram's, unclear to me actually if that's compliant. I think that's a very interesting thing to look up. So anti-steering is the blocker there.
Because I understood in a way that because I installed Instagram through the App Store, that means inside Instagram I cannot link out to anything that is outside the Apple ecosystem.
Yeah, so this is where it gets interesting, right? Because everything you download on Apple has to be downloaded through the App Store. And
Exactly.
So there has to be a sense in which this can't be the case, because then you can't download anything. Because even Chrome, you download Chrome initially through the App Store.
Yeah, it has to be like a word of mouth.
But even then, like, what would be the no? But Chrome is itself downloaded the App Store, so it cannot be the case. Like, browsers have to be the exception here. But it's something that I don't think we've seen for long enough to figure out, like where like how this is going to shake out. That's an essential question, right? Like, how can you direct users to your alternative app store? But regardless, I actually think anti-steering is. I've spoken to like the EU regulators, peoples, and like the American judicial system, as well as the DOJ, have signaled like link out is anti-steering policies are by far the most vulnerable part of the kind of like status quo app store policies in terms of government action, because it's fairly clearly quite anti-competitive to say you're not allowed to like tell your users about this competitive service. So link out policies like this was where Epic won, right? So Epic won this case. That the court ruled that it was anti-competitive for Epic to prevent informing or directing users to competitive payment channels. Apple's response to that was this 27% fee. So they said, all right, yeah, you can link out to an alternative payment channel, but you have to go through a submission process with us, and we have to approve it. B, you can only do it with this kind of language, and C, we'll charge you 27% on everything you sell through anyone who's linked out, right, as opposed to 30%. And when you combine that with outside payment fees, like, it doesn't make sense. I think 36 app developers opted into this since it came into effect in January, but that has been appealed by Epic in April, and they've had hearings on it the last kind of 2 weeks. The judge in America seems very, very skeptical of Apple's compliance with her ruling in this case. So I think you could see even America like linking out to alternative payments. Like, this is where I would watch the most vulnerability for sure.
Yeah, that's oh god damn it.
But I think that this is what is kind of exciting and different about this moment in government policy, is like that is a fair response after like years of kind of disappointment. But we are kind of seeing a different level of government involvement here, and then really not kind of bending. Like, the EU has signaled it's going to be very aggressive in enforcing the DMA. And the US judicial system, I mean, Apple is the subject of the biggest big tech antitrust lawsuit since the 1990s right now, announced in April. And even the Epic case, like, the judge seems like she's very much on the side of Epic, Microsoft, and Meta in thinking Apple is not being compliant. So I think if we are too defeatist, it doesn't serve us.
And when we're looking outside US and EU in terms of international policy changes, you mentioned India, like what's happening there? Is everything basically like GDPR, like it starts with EU and then it just cascades everywhere from there?
Yeah.
And why does it happen that way?
Yeah, so I think that the EU is kind of a good bureaucratic institution for experimenting policies. Like, so to some extent,
good bureaucratic institution. That is a healthy way to describe EU.
Well, they're technocrats, right? So, and the other thing is it's like very technocratic, like Brussels, kind of nerds, kind of. And so it is a good place for like lots of policy thinking and experimentation. But actually, probably the first move here was South Korea. And South Korea has a clear incentive here because it's where the OEMs are, right? Like Samsung, all of those companies are not getting a piece of this pie. And so the South Korean government was kind of the first to take serious action here, and that's still being litigated. The other big market to watch is Japan. So Japan has expressed real skepticism and is looking at the EU's DMA, the UK's DMCC. All these policies are kind of learning from one another. And so the successful failure of the problem with South Korea when they passed this is like they're not quite big enough to do this alone. So Apple and Google came back. It's where we first saw this 27% response, where they said, that's fine. We won't charge from payment processing, but we'll charge for a bunch of other made up fees and it'll be 27%. And then the South Korean government's not quite big enough to be like, no, the EU government probably is. So it's one of the reasons you see EU taking leading action is because it's a big enough market to like have some force here.
When you said South Korea is not getting a piece of the pie, what pie are we talking about?
Well, the App Store. Well, think about it, right? So, like, South Korea is where like Samsung is, LG.
Oh yeah.
all the
You meant like it's an Android market.
Yeah. Right? Well, no, it's more like the developers of Android devices. Are many of them are South Korean, and they are not getting any of this rev share. And so the South Korean industry, like business community, has a lot to gain from a more competitive App Store market because those companies are in theory very well positioned to launch competitive App Stores or payment products. So if you think about the domestic interests of industry, South Korea as a kind of like economy would benefit a lot from seeing a more open App Store ecosystem.
Because they would launch their Samsung App Store on Apple.
Well, no, or just like, I mean, so I don't think you'll see that happen because they can't make it work on Android yet. But like, a lot of the stuff that came out during the Epic trial against Google was like all this kind of not shady stuff, but like pretty dodgy stuff that Google was doing to prevent like Samsung being able to compete effectively with Google's Play Store, like paying developers, not forcing them to sign these agreements that like ban exclusivity, paying developers not to launch on the stores. So like a lot of these practices that are under tremendous scrutiny have been instrumental in preventing the success of like a Samsung App Store, for example, on Samsung devices, which I always think where they're best positioned to win.
Step into the future of game monetization with Xsolla. Xsolla empowers developers and publishers to market, sell, connect, and optimize their games globally. From payment solution to a full suite of tools designed to grow your game's revenue while fostering a loyal player base. Xsolla is your game's gateway to worldwide success. With Xsolla, the world is your playground. Visit xsolla.com today and find all the solutions that will help you to power your games into success everywhere.
Who is this good for? Like, I'm just trying to understand. Is this for those who have the resources to manage relationship with stores, or those who have the resources to build their own stores? Like is this good for the Epics and the Microsoft of the world? But most of the publisher will basically be under the boot of Apple, no matter what happens.
I think this is a real TBD. So right now, because of the landmines that Apple and Google have like erected here, and because it's basically the big guys are the only ones that can viably do this right now because they have to experiment and there's risk and you have to pay the core technology fee. And so right now it is not really viable for startups to be massively innovative in their distribution model, for example, because it's just expensive. Not really the case for maybe distribution startups. So like I do think you're seeing some competitive app stores really take a swing at this. Skeptical of that as a kind of pure play thesis. I think that there are very exciting, like, because these policy restrictions are like pretty restrictive. So for example, in Asia you have super apps, right? Like a single app where you have games and wallets and chat. We do not have that in the West because app stores ban store within store policies. So I think you could see some product innovation for startups there, but really I think the most excitement should be with existing games with large amounts of revenue where you don't really have any other initiative that could boost your margins by 15 to 20%. And so, you know, if you are like an at-scale mid-core game that's not really growing, shifting, 50% of your spend to a 3% cost channel instead of a 30% cost channel is huge. And so they can afford to and have the reason to do this. That's the other thing I'll say is like, getting a higher margin on your revenue only matters if you have revenue. And so that's another reason this is really most exciting for incumbents. But I do think Apple, Epic, Microsoft, like the potential store competitors, it's interesting to watch. I think the economic case there is questionable, but or at least uncertain.
Got it. And it's if they start so when they launch their stores, they will still have to win this legal battle, so that they don't have to pay so much for like 50 cents per install, as well as 20% of all the fees. And then it becomes a good case for Microsoft and Epic, right?
Well, I think the challenge of the EU market is like not huge for app stores, but like in fact, I think the economic case is already there, even with the existing policies for an alternative distribution model. The problem is you have like alternative app stores and alternative content. So the 50 cent per install fee sucks, but once you've paid it, and you do have to pay that annually, so it's an annual fee, not a one-time fee, which sucks.
What?
Yeah. So it's
this
every
is
time.
Bonkers. This is absolutely bonkers. Like, what the hell?
Because updates count as installs, and each install has to pay this once per year. And when you update your app, that counts as an install. So you basically have to pay this once per. Yeah. So if a user uses your app in a year, you'll pay 50 cents for it. if you've updated it. Yeah.
So if you don't update it through the cloud and you update it through...
If they push an update and a user has, let's say I download an app in 2024 and I use it and I stop using it and then I open it in January 2025 and they've pushed an update, and to open it I install the new update, bam, that's a new install that year. And so then I have to pay.
Holy shit.
And the thing that sucks about this is it's a fee that's owed before any revenue. And that's the nice thing about the commission structure is like it basically only charges developers who are making money. And this is what I think is so questionable about the core technology fee is like it just transforms the risk profile of distributing an app, right? Because if your app goes viral, next thing you know, you could owe Apple $50 million. So like, well, not 50 million, but like 10 million. And if you're a startup, that will bankrupt you, right? So, yeah. But I think that like, then again, once you've done that, you don't owe Apple anything on any revenue you make through that app. And so if I am making $25 per install, I'm saving a lot of money by just paying that 50-cent fee, because I'm paying 50 cents instead of whatever it is, like a third of 25, $7, $8.
I don't know. This is such a weird risk calculation that you have to be doing.
No, it's actually not that complicated though. Because just think about it like this: like, let's say your choices are distribute through Apple and pay 30%, or distribute through alternative app stores and pay 50 cents, right? So, and you have your app, and you know your app makes roughly $10 per install, or at least you can target this towards users that like will pay that. I mean, then you're saving, $2.50 because.
But isn't it that you have to make this choice? So before that, if you don't have to pay the core technology fee if you're downloading it from the App Store like you are right now, but if you start sideloading it, then you start paying the core technology fee, right?
Close. This is where it gets complicated. So you can opt into the alternative terms, or so you can either stick with the things that are. If you opt into the alternative terms, you can still distribute through the App Store, and on apps you distribute through the App Store, you pay two fees. You pay a reduced commission of 20%, not 30%, and the 50-cent fee per install above $1 million. Okay, so. But even that, right? Let's say you are an app developer right now that makes $10 an install, right? And you're thinking you should immediately opt into this, because yes, you will go from paying $10. You will go from paying $3 in commissions to Apple to $2.50, because it's 20% plus. The question is basically, if you make more than $5 per install, then the 10% commission saving starts being larger than the 50-cent fee. So it's not hugely complicated math.
Can you go back?
So this is the crazy thing. So when they announced it, the answer was no. They've now made a concession that you can go back one time. So when you regret,
why one time? Why Apple? Why?
Because they want you to learn your lesson and never do it again, right? Like I think a lot of this is about like not making. It's about providing a theoretical choice, right?
Yeah, the prodigal son returns home back to Apple. Now sit down and shut the fuck up.
It's kind of like that. It's kind of like that. Yeah. It's pretty wild.
Oh my god, so anti-competitive. Archie, where does the future lead us? Like what is, like you mentioned, if you make more than $5, and also you forget to mention like the biggest winners here are the web shops.
Well, the developers.
Dash.
The developers going through the web shops, yeah. So this is the important thing, is that like the government policy aspect of this I find fascinating, and it's certainly very exciting, but it's also not necessary for direct-to-consumer games to blow up. Playtika has been doing this for years. It's been building this product for 10 years, and it's doing $700 million a year through its direct-to-consumer channels. In fact, I think Playtika has declined in mobile revenue year on year for the last 3 years, since 2021, but has basically offset that by growing its web shop revenue so much. And that web shop revenue, they pay a cost of sales on that of 3 to 4% instead of 30%. And so no regulatory changes are necessary for Playtika to have already built the business it's built, $700 million. All the regulatory changes are great. And the other thing that what they're doing is they're just causing, I think, Apple and Google to exercise a little bit more caution in terms of how they're dealing with developers. So, whereas before they might have been a bit more heavy-handed with, banning your app or blocking you through review, I think now they'll be a little more careful. I think the future is going to see this category continue to explode, because a lot of non-regulatory factors are driving it, like technology, HTML5 distribution, cross-platform is huge here.
That's been maybe the biggest driver of like alternative payments revenues. But the regulatory stuff will continue to develop, and I think in favorable ways for developers, for app developers, because the EU seems like it's got teeth. I would definitely watch what happens in the American court cases, like notably Epic v. Google. Like Epic won that, but the judge has yet to issue a remedy. That should happen reasonably soon. Apple v. Google, like we'll see whether they fall out on whether or not the 27% link out policy is fair. And then the big one in America is the Department of Justice case against Apple. So I think this has nowhere to go but up, right? I think this could be the thing that like rescues the mobile games industry. It's like one of the reasons I went to work in this area is because I was looking at like just our industry after IDFA, and it was pretty bleak. And I think this is probably the most exciting development. And these could be as good for the industry as IDFA was bad for it.
Wow. So positive outcomes. And you've definitely you've put your career on this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'm a hero. I'm trying to rescue game developers.
To bring us back to growth.
I think it's also I think innovative developers should be thinking, how do I think about doing product innovation based on this thesis, right? Like if you can create a product premised on this economic model being slightly different from the kind of incumbents, I think that I would fund that company. I would love to see a few pitches with, smart developers thinking about how you design something around sideloading or how you design something around, web stores.
Well, those times are over. You ain't funding anything right now. You're just
No, I'm not. No.
You're now on the other side getting funded.
Yeah. Well, hopefully, so we're TBD on that one. Yeah.
Well, on that note, Mr. Archibald Stonehill, this was a fantastic DMA for Dummies episode, and I think we'll need to get back to this as the other court cases move forward, as there's changes, and especially as there are companies that are good examples that are taking advantage of this change in the environment and are following the $5 rule. If you get $5 or more, get your web shops up.
And if anyone is interested in talking about this stuff, as you can tell, I love talking about this stuff. And so if anyone is curious to find out if or how you can take advantage of this, like I will talk your ear off about this, and it is individual to your apps. Like, so this suits some apps beautifully, and other apps less so. But I think that like it's something everyone should be thinking about. So hit me up if you want to chat.
There you have, people. Get your DMAs, web shops ready. If you have that type of a games that could sustain this change. If not, continue to be under the boot and wait for better legislations that help everybody and not just those with high monetization.
Awesome. Thanks, Miska. Thank you for having me. It's been a delight.
Of course. And on that note, thank you everybody for listening. Archie's LinkedIn profile in the description below, as well as Stash, as well as the podcast.
Secret Stash. Check it out.
The Secret Stash.
Feedback is welcome. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Awesome. Thanks.
Bye-bye.